Wednesday Morning 3am is an album overshadowed by the sounds of silence with its jangly electric instrumentation, or perhaps that colossal bridge over troubled waters. Nevertheless, I consider this to be a most important album. Wednesday Morning 3am was an album that was made in 4 sessions in 1964. It's both prim and impassioned. Peter Carling said in his excellent book that it's the product of a fading era, yet the signpost to one about to begin, which is kind of the point I wish to make in this video. The album's cover captures a moment in musical history that just bristles with unease as both Simon and Garfunkel stand on the platform of 5th Avenue and 53rd Street station in New York as a train flashes by. The picture is gritty and has a sullied air to it. It's redolent of exhaustion and a night spent prowling subway stations beneath the neon fizz of a big city. This record very much differs from the albums that would follow, with its simple production showcasing that earnest folk which Paul Simon had been wooing audiences with throughout the UK, including his beloved Cathy. I mean, Paul and Artie had definitely moved on from the Tom and Jerry days. Paul Simon was no longer calling himself Jerry Landis. They did go through a period where they were calling themselves Kane and Gar before they became Simon and Garfield, before accepting Simon and Garfunkel despite the name sounding like a firm of solicitors.
I mean, after our early high school days when Paul Simon and I were writers of these Buddy Holly kind of country rock and roll songs, then came the age of Bob Dylan, and Paul became this wonderful first-rate poetic writer, and I easily deferred to that talent through our whole famous career.
As I said before, 1964 was the year that recording of this album began, produced by Tom Wilson and engineer Roy Halle. These sombre numbers survey the internal topographies of alienation and social disconnect.
And my writing for Simon and Garfunkel was naturally more, it's naturally more, I think, introspective than most. Like a shroud.
And as regards the material, it's certainly a mixed bag. We get an interesting cover of Dylan's At Times They Are Changing. Covers of Ed McCurdy's Last Night I Had This Strangest Dream, which takes us into this very faux naivety of a narrative where somehow war has been eliminated in the future.
Last night I had the strangest dream I'd ever dreamed before.
As well as an exquisite number of British writer Ian Campbell's The Sun Is Burning. These songs have performed remarkably well. A shout out has to go to the musicians on this album, as well as those beautiful voices. We get Barry Cornfield, who accompanies Paul Simon on guitar, and he plays fantastically on this record. But also Bill Lee's stand-up bass, which really contributes to the tones and textures on this album. March 31st, they finish this album with their version of Sparrow, which is a wintry parable of a bird dying due to the forces of vanity, greed and indifference.
From dust were ye made, and dust ye shall be.
Other interesting numbers on this album are Benedictus and a rendition of Bob Camp and Bob Gibson's You Can Tell the World. We get the standard Go Tell It on the Mountain and the tragic British love story O Peggy O. Interestingly, about this time, Dr. John Vincent, who was a Methodist minister, was saying of Paul Simon that Simon's songs abound in scriptural echoes and take up the theme of contemporary Christian searching, which kind of echoes what Bishop Barron was saying about Bob Dylan being essentially biblical in nature. Simon and Garfunkel were often pictured fresh-faced, wrapped in those college scarves, which proved somewhat irksome to the Greenwich Village crowd, who preferred a greater authenticity from their folk singers, and not so middle class with their Windsor knots and college degrees. They preferred the pained yawl of their folk heroes to see the dust and dirt of America's heartlands beneath their fingernails. And this was an audience captivated by Woody Guthrie's ramblings across the parched fields of America's Great Depression. Folk music needed to be about what was real, and what was real is the economic struggle of America's dispossessed. Whereas Paul Simon, as much as he liked the subtextual elements of folk music, preferred songs that weren't just editorial set to music. He much preferred songs that spoke of psychological pain and alienation. As Robert Christgau said, Simon's voice drips with self-pity from every syllable. In a nutshell, it was Dylan's literate diatribes and nasal sneer against modern society, which was preferable to the cotton-wool world represented in mainstream commercial music. And it has to be said that Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel were perhaps too tainted by the whiff of the Everly Brothers. They were just too nice and too middle class by far. Simon was attaching himself to authors like James Joyce, modernist poet Wallace Stevens, and Jewish American writer Saul Bellow. He would often scan poetry looking for ideas, themes and inflections that would work well in songs. He was very much about the quality of the writing rather than the actual power of the performance. Whereas Dylan castigates his audience, Simon just tells his story really, a palette which explores feelings and ideas. Serious thoughts, nevertheless, on identity, morality and injustice. This album, therefore, is important as it forges that mould for Simon and Garfunkel, which they would follow on the subsequent albums. It provides a perfect platform for Simon's songs and sets them apart from that New Jersey folk scene. They are as influenced by Jack Kerouac and Dylan Thomas as they are by the Everlys and rock and roll. They seem to have both feet in different camps. This becomes apparent with the addition of electric guitars on Sounds of Silence. A little bit more mainstream, they go all birds on us. Bleecker Street is the finest song on this album in my opinion and presents the seamier side of Greenwich Village, the seat of New York City's folk renaissance of course. It's strikingly biblical from the get-go with that opening line. It's a long road to Canaan on Bleecker Street. But my God, this song presents a melodic grace that epitomises Simon and Garfunkel. And the fog hanging over Bleecker Street becomes a metaphorical shroud, dividing the shepherd from the sheep, more biblical allusions here. And whereas the fog becomes a kind of a pall, if you like, the people are presented as shadows, like shadows on that cave wall. Apartments to rent for $30 a month immediately recalls the 30 pieces of silver paid to Judas Iscariot for the betrayal of Christ. Seems to suggest that Greenwich Village wants a paradise of art and ideals. It's now kind of bereft of anything good. It's a dire portrait and its blight is existential. He Was My Brother stands out as Simon's attempt to write in that journo-poetic style of Dylan, raging against violence directed at civil rights workers. It's about this time, of course, Paul Simon was spending a lot of time in the UK as a wandering, sort of itinerant bohemian folkie. In fact, Peter Carling's book paints an interesting picture of this time, if I may quote. A nightmare tumble of dreary weather, chemical streetlights, throngs of human automatons, ignored wisdom and soul-sucking isolation. All of it cloaked in silence, a suffocating hush deep enough to still tongues and deafen ears. The hush is paralytic, the creeping tendrils of living death, so speak up, hear my words that I may teach you, take my arms that I might reach you. What a remarkable sentiment, and the Sounds of Silence was built upon that sparse sequence of chords designed to fit a very beguiling melodic line. When the song was actually recorded, it was considered to be a perfect song for the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, if you don't know, were a folk trio about this time. Robert Guillaume, who was in the Pilgrims, was an actor who would later find fame playing Benson on American TV. Despite this album being a beautiful signpost to where Simon and Garfunkel were heading and where they'd been, this was not a successful album, and Paul Simon resumes his itinerant wandering life. Anyway, thank you for entertaining me and listening to my musing on this most important album. I urge you to click like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and do check that bell so you don't miss out on any uploads. Please check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work of this channel and think about becoming a Patreon. There's a fine body of work on there now. So I shall just leave you with my closing salvo, which, as you know, is hope you're all staying well and safe, and more importantly that you keep listening.